I had just set down the pecan pie when I heard it. "That seat's for my mother-in-law, get out." At first I thought Elias was joking. The tone was sharp, but he'd always had a strange sense of humor. I looked up expecting a grin, maybe even an awkward laugh. Instead, I saw his hand on the back of my chair. Then I felt the sudden shift. The chair scraped loudly against the floor as he yanked it back. And I fell. Right there in front of the roast ham and string beans and the wine glasses I gave him as a wedding gift. I landed on the floor like something that didn't belong. No one moved. Karina stood at the other end of the table, arms folded, her expression unreadable. My youngest granddaughter glanced at her phone. My oldest grandson looked down at his plate. Not one hand reached for me. "I told you already," Elias muttered, picking up the place card I had written by hand. "We needed that seat for Karina's mom. She's got a bad knee." I said nothing. I didn't trust my voice. Instead, I straightened my dress, lifted myself from the floor without help, and took my pie back to the kitchen. The place card with my name on it stayed behind, slightly crumpled, where his fingers had bent it. From the hallway, I could hear laughter again. The clinking of forks. Someone asking to pass the gravy. Life continuing as if the woman who raised him hadn't just been pushed aside like clutter. I stood by the sink, staring out the window. Snow dusted the branches, but I felt nothing. Just hollow. My hand touched the edge of the counter, and I steadied myself. Then I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the spare keys, and quietly left through the side door. By the time I started my car, they hadn't even noticed I was gone. The porch light flickered as I pulled into the driveway. I hadn't planned on leaving early, but I also hadn't planned on being humiliated either. I sat in the car for a few minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Then I turned, the key, stepped out, and walked up the path I'd shoveled that morning. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon oil. I'd cleaned it top to bottom 2 days ago, just in case Elias and the kids decided to stop by before Christmas. They never did. I set the pie on the counter still untouched and peeled off my gloves. The silence pressed in. No music, no voices, no clinking of dishes. Just me and a table set for one. I made tea out of habit, stirred in honey. Sat down at the little kitchen table Caleb had built with his own hands. The varnish was worn smooth from years of coffee cups and crossword puzzles. It was here, in this chair, that I'd first read Elias's letter about starting his own firm. His excitement bled through every sentence. "Mom, I just need one client to believe in me. Then I'll take off." And I did believe in him. I sold my wedding necklace, thick gold chain, small sapphire locket. It wasn't fancy, but it was the only piece Caleb ever gave me that I hadn't pawned during the bakery's worst winter. I used the money to help Elias buy his first printer. A cheap one, but enough to get started. I never asked for repayment. Never asked for anything, really. Just space at the table. I sipped my tea. It had already gone cold. Outside, the wind picked up. I sat at the table, my mind drifted, uninvited, back to the first Christmas after Elias married Karina. Ruth had come over that afternoon with cranberry scones and her usual sharp tongue. "She's charming," I'll give her that, Ruth had said, pouring coffee into the good china without asking. "But Varela, open your eyes. That girl only smiles when she's winning." I'd laughed it off. Told her she was being dramatic, but Ruth never said things she didn't mean. Looking back now, the signs were there. The compliments, with edges. Like the time Karina told me, "Your pie crust is just like the store-bought kind, so consistent." Or when she called my house quaint right after a remodel I'd paid for. Then there was the conversation I brushed off too quickly. It was spring, maybe 3 years ago. We were planting bulbs in the backyard when Karina looked up from her phone and said, "You know, when the time comes, we could find you a place somewhere warmer. Florida, maybe. One of those little senior communities with activities and, a shuttle." She smiled as if she were offering me a gift. I'd smiled back, but it sat heavy in my chest for days. Caleb would have seen it. He had a way of seeing through people, especially when they smiled too wide. He once said to me, "Don't trust the ones who act polite, but never ask how your hands feel after kneading dough all morning." Karina never asked. Not once. Some warnings are loud. Others sit in the quiet corners of your memory, waiting for you to stop pretending they weren't true. And I was done pretending. The folder was right where Caleb had left it, tucked in the bottom drawer of his old desk, still labeled in his handwriting, Cabin, Vermont. Private. Inside, everything looked familiar. The original deed signed by both of us. Notes about repairs, his sketches for a screened porch he never got to build. For a few minutes, I let myself drift into the past days when we drove up together with thermoses of coffee and no cell signal to worry about. But something gnawed at me now, a tight feeling in my chest that said, "Look deeper." I scanned the paperwork again. The deed still listed both our names. But I noticed one quiet change. The cabin's parcel number had a small asterisk scribbled beside it. Caleb never wrote asterisks. That was mine. And I hadn't added it. I pulled out my laptop and typed the parcel number into the state property records search. The result made my stomach turn. Current ownership, Dorn and Ledger, LLC. I stared at the screen, blinking. That was Elias's firm. I dug further, clicked through to the filing date. The transfer happened 5 years ago. I had never signed anything. I had never agreed to it. The paper trail ended there, at least for the moment. But it was enough. They hadn't just taken my seat at the Christmas table. They'd quietly taken the cabin too, piece by piece, signature by forged signature tucked into legal filings I never saw. I closed the folder, set it gently on the table, and walked to the phone. Tomorrow, I'd start calling. Not to ask for anything, but to reclaim what was mine. I started with Ruth. Harold used a real estate lawyer when his brother tried to sneak land out from under the family trust, she said. Jacob Fielding. Quiet, but sharp. Want me to call him? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me through the phone. Jacob called me an hour later. I told him everything I'd found. The transfer, the company name, my name now missing from the title. He didn't waste time. I'll pull the filing and request the supporting documents. If there was no signed release from you, it's not valid. Give me until morning. The second call was to Nicholas Grant, son of Caleb's estate lawyer. He pulled up our original trust agreement and confirmed, "You retained full control of the Vermont property." Caleb structured it that way, intentionally. Any attempt to sell or transfer without your signature is illegal. I thanked him. My voice stayed steady. The third call was to Mr. Kelman at the bank. He remembered me right away. We've had Caleb's fund on hold for years. Ready to activate it now I'm ready, I said. But Elias is to be removed from all permissions. Immediately. Already done, he said. You're the sole controller again. That evening, Jacob emailed me what he'd found. There it was, a fake authorization form, dated and signed with something that looked like my handwriting, but wasn't. Alongside it, a string of emails between Elias and a private realtor trying to move the cabin quietly after New Year's. Pending sale, just need Mom's signature cleaned up. Don't spook her. They were counting on my silence, my trust, my fear of confrontation, but they forgot something. I was married to a man who believed in preparing for storms, and I was done being quiet. Karina called 3 days after Christmas. Not to apologize, not even to ask how I was after being shoved to the floor in her dining room. She started with a bright tone, practiced but hollow. Hi, Mom. Just wanted to loop you in before things get too busy. I waited. We're moving forward with the cabin sale. Elias said you'd understand. We think it'll be better for everyone. Less stress, more liquidity, and we've found a buyer who's happy to take it as is. She paused like she expected me to argue. I didn't. That sounds reasonable, I said. I trust you both. She exhaled. I'm so glad you feel that way. I said goodbye and hung up. Then I walked to the kitchen drawer, where I kept the trust binder Caleb and I finalized the year before he died. The one Karina never asked about. The one I doubt Elias ever bothered to read in full. I opened to the tab labeled Property Ownership Contingency Structures. There it was, plain as day. Caleb had split control of the cabin through an LLC under his estate, but only 49% went to Elias. The remaining 51% had stayed with me buried under a quiet trust clause that required my signature for all sales transfers or dissolutions. They could email realtors. They could even stage photos and host private viewings. But they couldn't sell anything unless I signed. I closed the binder and stood very still. Better for everyone, Karina had said, like she was granting a favor. Like she assumed I'd roll over, nod politely, and fade out of the picture while they cashed in what was never theirs. What she didn't know, and what Caleb had always known, was that I may have been quiet, but I was never careless. They thought they were holding the pen, but the only name that could write the ending to this story was mine. And I was just getting started. I didn't call them. I didn't send a warning, not even a quiet signal of what was coming. I just signed the paperwork and let gravity take over. By 9 a.m. the next morning, Ruth had already texted, "Turn on your phone. It's starting." I brewed a pot of coffee and watched the sky shift through the kitchen window. The stillness in my house felt different now. Not empty, just clean. Like the air had been cleared. By noon, the fallout reached full speed. Elias woke up to 47 missed calls. I knew because Ruth's husband still had a contact inside the firm. The cabin sale had been frozen by the escrow company due to a legal challenge, my challenge. Worse for them, the audit request I'd filed with the state board had triggered a review. Dorn and Ledger's books were now flagged for irregular family-linked transactions, including questionable transfers from the LLC containing the cabin. One client emailed asking for a refund. Another requested full documentation of where their quarterly retainers had gone. Karina's mother, who never so much as looked at me at Christmas, was reportedly yelling in their kitchen, asking how they could be so stupid with something that valuable. Karina screamed too. Said something about her credit card being declined, and this wasn't the deal we made. Elias didn't raise his voice. He just sat there, stunned, scrolling through notifications, watching the empire he thought he'd secured slip away like sand through his fingers. "What did you do?" Karina yelled. He answered her with barely a whisper. I thought she wouldn't fight. But I did fight. Just not the way they expected. No shouting, no scenes, no warnings. Just the truth, slow, heavy, and undeniable. They had erased me in silence. I responded the same way. And now they were left scrambling while I was already setting the table for someone new. The invitation came in a text. No apology. No explanation. Just brunch tomorrow. Just us. Let's talk. Elias didn't even sign his name. I stared at the message for a full minute before deleting it. I didn't need closure from people who only remembered me when things were falling apart. Instead, I called Ruth and told her to bring her lemon scones and that loud friend of hers, Jeanette, who always told inappropriate stories at the best moments. By noon, my kitchen smelled like fresh biscuits. The coffee was hot, and there was laughter in the air. We sat around the table Caleb built, not the biggest table, but it had history in every dent and scratch. Ruth passed around the jam, and Jeanette told a story about sneaking rum into a church bake sale. I laughed so hard my ribs hurt. The news alert popped up on Ruth's phone halfway through the meal. She read it aloud without ceremony. Dorn and Ledger removed from Wexford Trust account due to ethical review pending resolution of internal audit. No one said anything at first. Then Ruth raised her mug. "To cleaning house," she said. We all clinked cups. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't even pride. It was just peace, the kind you only get when you finally stop begging for a seat at someone else's table. I'd spent years thinking that if I gave enough, loved enough, stayed quiet enough, they'd make space for me. That I'd be remembered, respected. But now I knew better. Respect doesn't come from silence. It comes from knowing when to stop giving. The chair they once offered me out of obligation, I didn't want it anymore. Not in their house. Not on their terms. After the dishes were cleared and the sun dipped low, I walked to the back room and unlocked the cedar chest. Inside was the envelope Caleb had left for me. I held it in my hands for a long moment, then carefully opened the seal. The drive to the cabin felt longer than I remembered. The roads had changed wider now, with more turnoffs and signs that didn't used to be there. But the trees still leaned in the same way, bending like they always had, toward the little gravel path that led up the hill. When I pulled in, the driveway was dusted with pine needles. The porch had a small crack in the railing, and the front step creaked louder than I expected. But it was still standing, still waiting. I unlocked the door with the old key Caleb had labeled Vermont. Us. The lock turned smooth like it had never forgotten my hand. Inside, the air smelled like dry wood and memory. The furniture was just as we'd left it, simple, worn, and exactly enough. The quilt I'd stitched during one of Caleb's chemo winters still hung on the back of the rocking chair. I sank into it and let the stillness wrap around me. The fireplace lit easily. I sat close, warming my hands, then reached for the leather-bound notebook Caleb had always kept on the mantel. I hadn't opened it since the week he died. Flipping through the pages, I found grocery lists, sketches of deck repairs, and halfway through a sentence underlined twice. If they forget what you gave, don't remind them. Just rebuild without them. I closed the book gently and rested it in my lap. That was always his way. Quiet, firm, not bitter, just clear. I walked to the small desk in the corner, pulled out the title transfer papers Nicholas had prepared, and signed my name where his had once been. Clean. Final. Enough. The cabin didn't need explaining. It didn't need to be justified. It just needed to be mine again. I placed the signed papers in the drawer, poured myself a mug of coffee from the old steel pot, and stepped out onto the porch. The trees swayed low in the wind, and the cold touched my face, like something familiar. I watched the light fade behind the hills, knowing tomorrow one last thing still needed to be sent. I sealed the envelope by hand. No return address. No note on the outside. Just his name in the corner written in my handwriting the same way I used to label his school lunchboxes. Inside, I placed the revocation papers. Formal, notarized final. Every legal tie severed. Every access point closed. No more permissions. No more shared ownership. No more trusting he'd remember what I gave. I tucked in the letter last. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. Enough. You gave my seat to someone else. Let her build your next empire. I won't be part of it. No anger. Just truth. I dropped it off at the small post office in town, nodding politely to the clerk who didn't know my name, but smiled anyway. Then I drove back to the cabin where the coffee was still warm and the snow had begun to settle like a blanket over the roof. I sat by the window with the mug between my palms. From here, I could see the trail Caleb and I used to walk when he felt strong enough. I remembered how he used to pause halfway through and say, "Let's just sit a minute." He always wanted to make room for quiet. Now I understood why. The phone rang once that evening. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't need to hear the panic or the excuses. I didn't need to be asked how I could do this. Because the truth was, I already had. I'd done the work, built the foundation, held them together through lean years, tough holidays, and unspoken grief. I'd given them a name, a home, a seat. And when they gave it to someone else, they thought I'd fade into the background. But I didn't. I simply walked away, not in weakness, but with the power they never saw coming. The cabin lights glowed soft against the dark. I sipped my coffee, leaned back in Caleb's old chair, and let the silence settle around me. This was my seat now, and no one would ever take it from me again.